Welcome back to Tartan Lullaby. I'm Archie, and tonight there's a long, quiet story waiting for you. Before we begin, take a moment to settle in. Find your pillow. Soften your shoulders. Let the day go. Tartan Lullaby tells slow stories of Scotland. Real places, real years, real people, told gently enough to fall asleep inside. There's no music tonight, and no need to follow every word. If you drift off in the first few minutes, the rest will play on quietly without you. That's how it's meant to be. If these stories are a quiet corner you find yourself returning to, a subscription would mean a great deal, and it helps us keep making them. The artwork you see throughout tonight's story is available as a print in our Etsy shop, if you'd like to bring a little of Scotland onto your walls. When you're ready, close your eyes and we'll begin. Tonight, the Isle of Iona, 563 AD, Isle of Iona and the Celtic monks. This is Tartan Lullaby, sleep history from Scotland. The sky above the sound of Iona is still dark. A thin line of grey sits on the eastern horizon just above the low hills of Mull. The water between the two islands is shallow and cold, running perhaps a mile and a half across at its narrowest point. It does not yet reflect any light worth speaking of. The island itself is small. It measures roughly 3 miles from north to south and no more than a mile and a half across at its widest. A man can walk its full length before the morning meal if he moves at a steady pace. The ground underfoot is uneven, shaped by glaciers long before any human foot pressed into it. The western shore faces out into the open Atlantic. Waves come in off that ocean with nothing to slow them, having crossed hundreds of miles of open water. They break against pale shell sand beaches, and the sound carries inward across the island in the dark. On a calm morning, it is a low and constant wash. On a rougher one, it is deeper, more insistent. The eastern shore is quieter. The sound of Iona sits between this island and the Ross of Mull, and the land on both sides gives the water some shelter. Small boats can be pulled up here without too much difficulty. The shore is rocky in places, sandy in others, and the seaweed left by the tide has a sharp, salt-heavy smell that settles over everything near the water's edge. The rock beneath the island is among the oldest on Earth. It is Lewisian gneiss, grey and pink and streaked, worn smooth in places and rough in others. It breaks through the thin soil in outcrops and ridges all across the island. The soil itself is not deep. In places, it is little more than a few inches over the rock. In the lower-lying ground toward the south and the center of the island, the soil is thicker, darker, and holds moisture through the summer months. There are low hills running roughly north to south. Duneye is the highest point on the island, rising to about 101 meters above sea level in the northern part of the island. From its summit on a clear day, a man can see the Garvelachs to the northeast, Colonsay to the southwest, and the long ridge of the Paps of Jura further south still. In this hour before dawn, Duneye is a darker shape against a dark sky, nothing more. The Machia runs along the western side of the island. It is low, flat ground, built up from centuries of shell sand blown in off the Atlantic beaches. It is remarkably fertile for such a windswept place. In late spring and summer, it carries wildflowers in extraordinary numbers. But in 563, this is the sixth month of the year, and the growth is underway but not yet at its height. The matcha smells of grass and damp earth and faintly of the sea. To the south of the island lies the promontory known in later centuries as the Matcha. The ground there is low and exposed. The wind comes across it without obstruction. A person standing there in the dark can feel it pressing steadily from the southwest, not violent this morning, but present. The grass bends in long, slow movements. There are no trees of any size on the island. There are none in 563, and the wind has always made sure of that. Small shrubs grow in sheltered hollows, heather covers the higher ground, and bog rushes fill the wetter patches. The absence of woodland means the sky is always visible, even from the ground. The horizons are wide in every direction. The community that has come to this island is newly arrived. Columba, a monk from the kingdom of Dal Rioter in Ireland, landed on this island in the late spring of 563 with 12 companions. He had come from Derry, sailing north around the Irish coast, and then east across the stretch of open water between Ireland and the western islands of what is now Scotland. The distance from Derry to Iona is roughly 120 miles. They came in a curragh. This was a vessel made from a wooden frame covered with animal hides, sealed with tallow or pitch. A curragh of the kind used in the 6th century could carry several men along with their provisions and belongings. It was light enough to be carried by a small group and flexible enough to move well through the Atlantic swell. The crossing would have taken 2 days in reasonable conditions. The island they arrived at was not uninhabited. There is evidence of human settlement on Iona stretching back several thousand years. There are burial cairns on the island that predate the arrival of Columba by millennia. The island sat within the territory of the kingdom of Dal Rioter, which by the 6th century stretched across both northeastern Ireland and the western coast of what is now Scotland. The local king, Conall mac Comgaill, is thought to have granted the island to Columba for the establishment of a monastic community. What that community looked like in its very earliest days was simple. There were no stone buildings. The monks built in timber and wattle, using techniques common to Ireland in this period. The individual sleeping cells, the oratory, the refectory, the kitchen, the workshop, the guest house, all were built from timber frames packed with woven branches and plastered with clay or mud. These structures were low, dark inside, and smell of the materials that made them. Damp timber, clay, rush flooring. The sleeping cells were individual huts, round or rectangular, each housing one monk. They were small, perhaps 4 feet across inside. A monk slept on a straw pallet or on a wooden board. There was no heating in the cell. Warmth in the night came from the wool of the monk's blanket, which was coarse and undyed, woven from the fleece of small, hardy sheep. Outside the cells, the ground between the huts was worn to mud, where feet had passed repeatedly over the same paths. The larger communal structures were grouped together, ringed by a low earthwork boundary known in Irish as a vallum. The vallum at Iona was not a wall in any grand sense. It was a raised bank of earth and turf, perhaps 4 feet high in places, marking the boundary of the sacred enclosure. It separated the monastic buildings from the rest of the island. Within the vallum, the monks ate, prayed, slept, and worked. Outside it, they farmed and fished. The vallum ran roughly northeast to southwest, enclosing the main cluster of buildings on a slight rise of ground above the eastern shore. The Tor and Abba, a rocky knoll in the center of this area, is thought to have been associated with Columba himself, though the structures of his time have long since disappeared into the ground. In this hour before dawn, the knoll is simply a dark hump in the near darkness. Water drips from the heather on its slopes. The monks follow the divine office. This is a cycle of prayer divided across the day and night. The first office of the day, matins, is said in the deep night, often around 2 or 3 in the morning. Lauds follows before dawn. By the time the sky over Mull begins to lighten in the east, some of the monks have already been awake for several hours. They have prayed in the small timber oratory, breathing air that smells of tallow candles and cold stone and the wool of their habits. The habit worn by a monk of Columba's community was a simple garment. It was a long robe, probably undyed or pale in color, worn over a linen tunic. Over this, a hood and a rough outer cloak provided some warmth against the wind and rain. The monks went barefoot inside the enclosure. Outside on the rough ground and on farm work, they wore simple leather shoes, shaped from a single piece of hide and fastened with a strap. The bell for the next office is a small iron handbell. It is rung by whoever holds that duty on a given day. The sound it makes is not the deep resonance of a later church bell. It is thin and high, carrying a short distance. On a calm morning, it can be heard clearly across the enclosure. On a windy morning, a monk on the far side of the vallum might not hear it at all. The wind this morning is light. It comes from the southwest, as it does on most mornings here. It carries with it the salt of the Atlantic and the faint smell of the sea wrack exposed on the rocks at low tide. The tide is running out now. The water is pulling back from the eastern shore, leaving a strip of wet sand and dark weed between the grass and the sea. A curlew calls once from somewhere near the shore, a long falling note, and then is silent. The sky is shifting, not brightening, not yet, but changing in quality. The darkness in the east is now a deep blue rather than black. The outline of the hills of Mull is becoming a firm edge. The highest point of those hills, Ben More on Mull, rises to just over 966 meters. On a clear morning, it will catch the first light long before anything down on the water does. Today there is thin cloud, and the light will come in gradually, without drama. The monks who are awake at this hour move quietly between the huts. Their feet are accustomed to the paths. They do not need light to know the way between the oratory and the cell, between the cell and the kitchen building. The ground is damp from overnight dew. The grass outside the vallum is heavy with it. Where the bare earth paths run within the enclosure, the mud has a cold, faint smell of iron. In the kitchen building, a fire has been banked overnight in the stone hearth. The hearth is built directly onto the ground. Stones are arranged in a rough ring, and the embers of last night's fire still hold some heat. The monk tasked with the morning fire will come in before the others are fully awake and rebuild it. The fuel used is peat, cut from the boggy ground in the center of the island. Peat burns slowly and smoky, giving off a heavy, sweet smell that settles into clothing and hair and the timber of the walls. Food in this community is plain and limited. The monks follow a rule of life that includes regular fasting. On ordinary days, a meal of bread and vegetables, and perhaps some dried or salted fish, would be eaten in the refectory at midday and again in the early evening. The bread is baked from barley, not wheat. Wheat does not grow reliably this far north and west. Barley is hardier, and the monks cultivate it on the lower ground to the south and west of the enclosure, where the soil carried by the machia is deepest and richest. The vegetables grown here in this period would have included leeks, cabbage, and onions. Root crops of the kind familiar in later centuries were not yet in use. Dried peas and beans were also stored and eaten. The diet was adequate but narrow. In winter, and in years when the harvest was poor, it became genuinely sparse. Fish came from the sea around the island. The waters of the Sound of Iona and the Atlantic beyond the western shore carried cod, saithe, and herring in this period. The monks fished from the shore with lines and from boats when conditions allowed. The small curragh that brought them from Ireland would have been used for fishing in the calmer waters of the Sound. Larger fish might be dried or salted for storage. Smaller ones might be eaten fresh the same day they were caught. The smell of the drying fish, hung on wooden frames near the shore, is part of the ordinary smell of the place. It mingles with the peat smoke from the kitchen fire, with the salt air, with the dampness of the grass and the mud of the paths. These are the smells a monk of this community would have known every day of his life on the island. There are animals here too. Cattle are kept for milk and for haulage. The cattle of this period in Scotland were small and hardy, darker in colour than later breeds, with long horns. They would have been kept in a simple enclosure near the farm buildings outside the main vallum. In the early morning, before they are let out to graze on the machia, they stand in the dark, their breath rising in thin clouds. The low sound of them moving in their enclosure carries faintly across the still air. Pigs are kept as well, rooting in the ground near the midden. Hens move freely in the mornings, scratching at the mud near the kitchen building. Their small, persistent sounds begin before the light is strong enough to see them clearly. Goats are mentioned in later accounts of similar monastic communities in Ireland, and there is no reason to think Iona was different. They would have been kept for milk, and for the occasional provision of meat at times when the community had guests or was observing a feast day. The sea is becoming visible now, not fully but as a presence. There is enough grey in the eastern sky to show the surface of the Sound of Iona as a flat, darker plain below the hills of Mull. A small boat, a simple logboat or a light curragh, is pulled up on the shore above the tide line. It sits on its side against a boulder, tied with a rope of twisted plant fibre or leather. The rope is wet with dew. The hull of the boat smells of pitch and salt and wet hide. The monks who have completed the night office are moving back toward their cells or toward the oratory for the dawn prayers. Their feet make almost no sound on the wet ground. The bell will ring again in a few minutes. Outside the vallum, the Macchia to the west is beginning to take shape, a long pale strip between the dark ground and the dark sky, the shell sand lightening first as the sky above it changes. The sky above the Ross of Mull is still dark. Across the narrow sound, the island sits low in the water, barely a mile from the mainland shore. It is perhaps 4 in the morning. The monks and the lay workers who have come with Columba are already stirring. Columba arrived from Ireland in the late spring of 563. He brought with him 12 companions. Most were monks from the monastery at Derry. Some were his kinsmen from the Uí Néill dynasty of the north of Ireland. They crossed the sea in a curragh, a boat made from a wooden frame covered in tanned ox hide. The crossing from the Antrim coast would have taken roughly 2 days, following the island chain northeastward. The island they landed on was not uninhabited. Iona had been known to the Dáil rioter for generations. The Dáil rioter were the Irish-speaking people who had been moving into what is now Argyll since at least the 5th century. There were likely a small number of people already living and farming on the island when Columba's party arrived. The island sits roughly 3 miles long from north to south, and about 1.5 miles wide at its broadest point. The landscape in 563 is wetter than it looks today. The low ground between the central ridge and the western Macchia is boggy in places. The Macchia itself, the flat sandy grassland along the western shore, is already covered in early summer grass. The monks would have noticed the soil there was thin but workable. They would also have noticed the wind. On most mornings, even in June, the wind comes in from the southwest across the Atlantic, steady and cold before sunrise. The first workers rising this morning are not all monks. The community Columba established at Iona included lay brothers, men who were not in holy orders but who lived and worked alongside the monks. They would have been craftsmen and farmers, men with practical skills that the building of a new monastic settlement required. In the early 6th century Irish church, this arrangement was already well established. Monasteries in Ireland, such as Clonard and Clonmacnoise, had operated with similar mixed communities for a generation before Columba's birth. The lay brothers sleep apart from the monks. The monks at this stage sleep in individual wattle cells, small round structures built from interwoven hazel and willow rods. These cells are modest enough. A man can lie down at full length, and there is room for a wooden board that serves as a bed, a few stones arranged around a small central fire pit, and a single clay oil lamp. The lamp burns fish oil. The smell is specific and persistent. The monks wake to it every morning. The lay workers sleep in a longer structure. It is a longhouse, likely around 12 meters in length. The walls are of drystone construction, using the local pink granite that outcrops all across the island. The roof is of timber rafters, cut from birch and oak brought across from the mainland, and thatched with reed gathered from the boggy ground near the eastern shore. The floor is beaten earth, with rushes laid down in the sleeping areas. In the morning, the rushes nearest the central hearth are dry and warm. The men who rise first are the ones who tend the animals. The community has brought cattle with them from Ireland. This was common practice. Cattle were the primary measure of wealth in early medieval Irish society, and a new monastic settlement without cattle would have been poorly provisioned. They also have goats. Goats were better suited to rocky, marginal land than cattle, and Iona has plenty of rocky, marginal land. The goat keeper rises before anyone else, while the sky is still a deep grey-blue over the sound. He wears a lein, the basic garment of early medieval Irish life. It is a long linen tunic falling to mid-calf. Linen was produced in Ireland from flax, which was grown in large quantities in the north of the island by this period. The lein is undyed and off-white in colour. Over it he wears a brat, a rectangular woolen cloak pinned at the shoulder with a simple iron pin. His brat is a dull brownish green, the colour of wool dyed with lichen. He has no shoes this morning. The ground near the animal pen is churned mud, and leather shoes would be ruined quickly. The animal pen is built close to the eastern shore. It is a circular enclosure of drystone walling, perhaps 15 meters across. The stones have been gathered from the hillside above. The pen has been in use for only a few weeks, but already the ground inside is thick with dung. The goat caper clears it with a wooden-bladed tool, something between a spade and a hoe. The dung will be mixed with bracken and spread on the small plots of ground the community has begun to cultivate on the northern end of the island. Before he goes out to the pen, the goat caper eats. The food this morning is the same as most mornings. There is a pot of porridge made from oats ground with a rotary quern. The quern is made of two circular stones, the upper one turned by hand using a wooden peg inserted into a hole in its surface. The oats came across from the mainland. The community does not yet produce enough of its own grain. They rely on supplies brought by boat from dull riotous settlements on the Argyll coast. The porridge is thickened to a solid mass. It is eaten cold because there is no time to heat it again. It is flavored with a little salt, and sometimes with dried dulse, the reddish seaweed gathered from the rocks of the eastern shore. There is also bread, though not every morning. The bread is unleavened, made from barley flour mixed with water and cooked on a flat stone placed in the embers of the fire. It is dense and slightly smoky. A monk or worker might eat a single piece the size of his palm. This is not a community that eats lavishly. The early Irish monastic tradition placed considerable emphasis on austerity, and Columba himself was known from the accounts later written at Iona, to eat and drink sparingly. The monks eat later than the lay workers. Their morning begins with prayer in the small oratory that has been built at the center of the settlement. The oratory is also of drystone construction, a simple rectangular building perhaps 6 meters by 4. It has no windows. Light comes in through the single doorway which faces east. The wooden door is fitted with a simple iron hinge made by the community's smith. At this stage, the oratory is newly finished. The lime mortar used between some of the stones is still curing. On cold mornings, it smells faintly of the shells from which the lime was burned. The smith is among the most important members of the community. He works at a forge set slightly apart from the main cluster of buildings on the southern side of the settlement. This is deliberate. Forges produce sparks, and a spark landing on a thatched roof is a serious danger. The forge itself is a stone hearth, roughly circular, about a meter across. The fuel is charcoal, not peat. Charcoal burns hotter than peat and is needed for ironworking. The charcoal is made in a pit on the hillside, where wood is burned slowly under a covering of turf to drive off the gases. The smith produces charcoal as a regular part of his work cycle. His bellows are made from 2 flat pieces of wood and a piece of ox hide stitched together. A nozzle of iron pipe directs the air into the base of the hearth. The bellows are operated by hand, pumping steadily to raise the temperature of the coals. Before the rest of the settlement has fully woken, the smith has already been at his hearth for half an hour. Iron does not wait for daylight. The smith makes tools. He makes the iron pins that fasten cloaks. He makes the hinges and hasps for the wooden doors of the buildings. He makes the small iron styluses, called iron pens, that the scribes will use to score lines on their writing surfaces. He makes chisels for the stone workers. He makes the hooks and rings used in the animal pens. He makes nails, though nails are used sparingly, because iron is expensive. The raw iron comes in bars from the Irish mainland, brought across by the same boats that bring grain and other supplies. The scribes are a separate group. At this early stage, in 563, the great work of manuscript production, for which Iona will later become famous, has not yet properly begun. But the tradition is already present. Columba himself was a trained scribe. He had studied under the monk Finian at Mouville in what is now County Down. He had copied manuscripts there, and it was a dispute over the ownership of a copied psalter that contributed, according to later sources, to the conflict that led to his departure from Ireland. Scribing was already in his hands when he landed on Iona. The scribes work in a building called the scriptorium, though at this stage it is simply a room set aside in one of the larger structures. The light inside is poor in the early morning. Work does not begin in earnest until the sun is well up, but preparation begins early. Vellum, the writing surface made from stretched and scraped calf skin, must be prepared. A fresh piece of vellum is stretched on a wooden frame and left to dry overnight. In the morning, it is scraped again with a curved iron blade called a lunellum to remove any remaining fat from the surface. The ink is made from oak gall. Oak galls are the small round growths that appear on oak leaves when a certain wasp lays its eggs inside them. They are collected, dried, and then crushed and soaked in water with a small addition of iron sulfate and a binding agent such as gum arabic. The gum arabic must be imported. It comes originally from North Africa or the Eastern Mediterranean, traded along routes that reached Ireland through Gaul and the Iberian coast. Even on this small island, in this early period, the trade connections are longer than they appear. The building work continues on the northern side of the settlement. Iona in 563 is a site under active construction. The community has been here only a matter of weeks. Additional cells are needed, and the larger communal buildings are still being completed. The builders work with dry stone walls and wooden roofs. There is no dressed stone at this stage. The stones are gathered as they are found, sorted roughly by size and stacked without mortar. The larger flat stones are used for lintels over doorways. The builders are experienced. In Ireland, this type of construction had been practiced for centuries, and the techniques were well understood. The timber work is done by a small number of men with axes and adzes. The axe is used to fell and rough shape the wood. The adze, a tool with a curved blade set at a right angle to the handle, is used to smooth the surface of planks and beams. The adze work is slow and precise. A skilled man with an adze can produce a surface almost as smooth as a modern plane would achieve. The timber used for roofing comes mostly from the mainland. Iona itself has very few trees of any size. There are willows along the wet ground in the interior, and some hazel scrub on the sheltered eastern slopes, but nothing suitable for structural timber. The walk from the sleeping quarters to the work sites varies by trade. For the animal keepers, it is a short walk of perhaps 200 meters to the eastern shore pens. For the builders working on the northern end of the settlement, it may be half a mile. For the smith, his forge is within the settlement perimeter, perhaps 50 meters from the main longhouse. The scribes do not walk far at all, but the monk who manages the community's small boat makes a longer journey each morning. He walks south along the eastern shore to the small beach where the curragh is beached and turned upside down each night to drain. The curragh is checked every morning for damage. The oxhide covering must be kept supple and watertight. It is treated regularly with animal fat. Any small tears are patched immediately using a piece of spare hide and a paste of fat and pine resin. The pine resin is another imported material brought from the mainland. The curragh is the community's lifeline. Without it, there is no communication with the dull, riotous settlements on the Argyll coast, no supply of grain or iron bar or gum arabic, no passage for the occasional visitor who arrives seeking Columba's counsel. The man who keeps the boat in repair is not celebrated in any of the texts that survive from Iona, but his work is as necessary as the scribes or the smiths. The sun has now begun to show above the low hills of the Ross of Mull to the east. The light reaches the western Machir first touching the grass with a pale gold. The wind has not dropped. It rarely does this close to the open Atlantic. The goats have been let out of their pen and are moving along the rocky northern shore. The smith's bellows are already sounding. The first prayers of the morning are finished in the oratory, and the monks are beginning to disperse to their various tasks. The day on Iona in the summer of 563 has properly. The tide has pulled back from the western shore. The sand is dark and wet, and the light is low across the water. It is early morning on the island of Iona, and the monks have already been at prayer since before the sun came up. Columba arrived on this island 2 years ago in 563 with 12 companions. They came from Ireland in a curragh, a small boat of tarred hide stretched over a wooden frame. They landed on the southern shore, at the place the monks now call Port na Curach, the harbour of the coracle. The beach there is made of rounded green pebbles, and the boat was hauled up above the tide line and turned over on the stones. The settlement they have built since then sits on the eastern side of the island, sheltered from the worst of the Atlantic wind. It faces across the narrow strait toward the larger island of Mull. The water in that strait runs fast. In the morning it catches the light and throws it back in long flat lines. The monastery is not built of stone. It is a collection of timber and wattle structures, low and practical, set within an earthen bank. That bank is the vallum, the enclosure that marks the boundary of the monastic community. To step across it is to move from the ordinary world into the sacred one. The monks understand that distinction clearly. The main work of this community in the year 563 is the production of books, specifically the copying of sacred texts by hand. This is the primary industry of the monastery at Iona, and it shapes the entire rhythm of daily life on the island. Everything else, the farming, the fishing, the building, serves this central purpose. The books are the reason the monastery exists. The scriptorium is a long timber building set within the vallum. The walls are woven hazel wattle, packed with clay and dried in the summer air. The roof is thatched with reed from the wetland areas at the north end of the island. There are no windows in the glass sense. Light comes through small openings, covered in thin-scraped animal membrane when the wind is sharp, left open on clear mornings. The floor is packed earth. In winter, there is a small central hearth, but it is not lit in summer. Smoke and books do not mix well, and the monks know this. The monks work at long, low tables or at individual wooden desks tilted at a slight angle. A monk sits on a low stool or kneels on a wooden pad. He keeps his back straight. The posture is important, not for reverence, though that too, but because a bent back makes for uneven script. The tools of the trade are arranged in a specific order on the work surface, and each monk tends to his own tools as carefully as a farmer tends to his plough. The principal tool is the quill. On Iona in the 6th century, the most commonly used quills come from the wing feathers of geese and swans. The large primary feathers are the most valued. A monk who is responsible for preparing quills will have gathered them in the early weeks of summer, when the birds are molting, and the feathers can be collected from the ground near the wetlands at the island's north. A fresh quill must be dried and hardened before it is of any use. The monks harden them in warm sand or hold them near the heat of the hearth for a period of days. Once hardened, the quill must be cut. This is done with a small knife called a penknife, the name coming directly from the Latin penna, meaning feather. The blade is kept very sharp. A monk might sharpen his penknife 3 or 4 times in a single working morning. The cut at the tip of the quill is oblique, meaning it is made at an angle, not straight across. Then a slit is cut along the nib to allow the ink to flow evenly. The width of the cut determines the width of the stroke. A narrow cut produces fine lettering. A broader cut produces the thick downstrokes that characterize the insular script these monks use. The ink itself is made within the monastery. The monks on Iona in this period use a carbon-based ink made primarily from soot. The soot is collected from the walls and underside of the roof near the hearth. It is ground down carefully on a flat stone, the same kind of grinding motion used for grain on a quern, slow and circular, until the particles are very fine. This ground soot is then mixed with a binding agent, usually gum arabic, though on Iona the monks may have used local plant resins when gum arabic was not available from trade. The mixture is thinned with water to the right consistency, a consistency the experienced scribe judges by touch and sight, by how the ink falls from the raised quill tip in a slow, unbroken thread. Oak gall ink is also known in this period, though it becomes more common in later centuries. It is made by crushing the round growths that form on oak trees when a particular wasp lays its eggs in the bark. The galls are soaked in water and the liquid is mixed with iron salts and gum. This ink is darker and more permanent. Whether the Iona monks of 563 use it is not certain, but the knowledge of it exists in the broader monastic world they are connected to. The parchment the monks write on is made from animal skin, most commonly calf, sheep, or goat. The preparation of parchment is heavy physical work, and it takes place outside the scriptorium, at the edge of the monastic enclosure where the smell will not disturb the other work. A freshly slaughtered animal is skinned carefully, with attention to keeping the hide intact. The hide is then soaked in a solution of water and lime, a process called liming, for a period of several days. The lime loosens the hair and softens the outer layers of skin. After liming, the hide is stretched on a wooden frame. The frame is made from curved branches lashed together with cord, and the hide is tied to the frame at its edges using loops of cord or thin strips of leather. As the hide dries, it is scraped repeatedly with a lunellum, a crescent-shaped iron blade. The scraping removes the remaining hair, the fat, and the uneven surfaces. It also stretches the hide further as it dries under tension. The sound of the lunellum on the drying hide is a dry, rhythmic scraping. It can be heard across a fair part of the monastic settlement on a quiet morning. The monk doing this work is often one of the younger brothers, or one who has not yet achieved the precision required for scribal work. It is laborious. A single sheet of good parchment requires a full morning of careful scraping. The frame must be checked repeatedly to ensure the tension is even. If one side dries faster than another, the parchment will be warped, and a warped sheet cannot be written on cleanly. The monk checks the tension by pressing the skin lightly with one finger and feeling how it responds. Once scraped and fully dried, the parchment is cut from the frame and trimmed with a straight-bladed knife against a wooden rule. The sheets are stacked and stored flat in the scriptorium, away from damp. The island of Iona has damp in abundance. The western Atlantic climate brings mist and rain across the Machia and the low inland ground. The monks are careful about where they store their materials. The Machia itself, the low coastal grassland that runs along the western side of the island, is grazed by cattle and sheep. These animals provide not only hides for parchment, but also milk, wool, and occasional meat. The monastery in this period is largely self-sufficient in food. The fields in the flatter ground near the eastern shore are cultivated with small ploughs drawn by oxen. The crops are oats and barley, the standard crops of 6th century Scotland. Rye is also grown in small quantities. The grain is ground at a hand quern, a stone rotary mill, and the flour is baked into flatbreads on a hearthstone. There is no raised bread in the modern sense. The loaves are thin, slightly charred at the edges where they touch the hot stone. The monks eat twice a day in the warmer months, once in the colder. The main meal is taken in the early afternoon. It consists of bread, cooked grain porridge, vegetables from the kitchen garden, and occasional fish. The fish come from the strait between Iona and Mull, and from the open water to the west. The monks fish with line and hook, and with small nets set from the shore at low tide. The fish caught most commonly in these waters are herring, cod, and various flatfish. Seabirds are also taken on occasion, and their eggs collected from the cliffs on the western shore in spring. The boats used by the Iona community are the same type that brought Columba from Ireland. The curragh is a frame of light wooden rods, bent and lashed, over which tarred ox hides are stretched. The seams are sealed with tallow. The boat is light enough to be carried by 2 men. It is launched into the surf and pulled out again after each use. Leaving a curragh in the water overnight risks waterlogging and damage. The boats are kept on the shore above the tide line, turned upside down, the dark hides facing the sky. A larger, more substantial vessel, made of planked timber in the tradition of the Irish and Scottish coasts, is used for longer crossings and for carrying loads. This type of vessel is called a name hog in the Irish tradition, though the naming varies. The timber for building and repair comes from the mainland, as Iona has very few trees of significant size. Hazel and willow grow in sheltered hollows on the island and are used for wattle and basketwork, but oak and pine must come by boat from the forests of Argyll across the water. The sound of the island in the morning is specific. There is the wind, almost always. There is the sound of the surf on the western Machia, a low, continuous sound that changes with the tide but never fully stops. There is the sound of cattle from the eastern pasture and the sound of monks in the church at the canonical hours. The hours are marked by a handbell struck by whoever has that duty for the week. The bell is iron, small, cast in a simple D shape. Its sound carries clearly across the enclosure. Within the scriptorium, through the working hours between morning prayer and midday prayer, the dominant sound is the scratch of quill on parchment. It is not a loud sound. It is quiet, regular, and continuous. The monks do not speak while working. Silence is observed in the scriptorium as a matter of discipline. If a monk needs more ink, he signals with a gesture to the brother who acts as the reader for the session, the lector, who reads aloud from scripture or commentary while the others write. The reading is done at a steady pace, neither fast nor slow, calibrated to allow the scribes to work without rushing. The text being copied in 563 is most likely biblical. The Psalms are copied frequently as they form the core of the daily liturgical prayer. The Gospels are also essential. The books of the Hebrew Scriptures, what the monks call the Old Testament, are copied as well, though perhaps less urgently than the New. The specific manuscript being produced on any given day is chosen by Columba himself, or by whoever he designates as head of the scriptorium. Columba is known in the tradition as a man who copied manuscripts himself daily with great discipline. This is not merely legend. The accounts suggest a founder who valued the physical act of writing as deeply as the act of prayer. Each completed page is inspected before the ink fully dries. The monk responsible for quality, sometimes called the corrector, reads the text against the source manuscript to check for errors. An error in a biblical text is a serious matter. It is not merely a mistake. It is a potential corruption of the sacred word as understood by this community. Small errors are corrected with a knife, scraping away the surface of the parchment gently, then overwriting. Larger errors may require the page to be discarded entirely, the parchment soaked and rescrubbed if possible. Parchment is too valuable to waste without making the attempt to recover it. The light in the scriptorium shifts through the morning as the sun moves. The small membrane-covered openings let in a pale, diffused light. A monk working at the southern end of the long room has better light in the morning hours. A monk at the northern end works in dimmer conditions. This is not a matter of preference. It is assigned by the senior brother. The placement of monks within the scriptorium reflects rank and seniority as much as practical need. Outside, the tide has turned again. The water in the strait is running south now, smooth and dark, carrying the morning light toward the open sea. A younger monk has come down to the shore below the vallum to fill 2 clay vessels with fresh water from the spring that rises near the eastern tide line. He sets them down on the flat rock above the waterline and kneels to fill them in turn. The work of the morning is well underway, and the bell for midday prayer is still several hours distant. The fire has burned low. A thin rope of smoke rises through the hole in the roof, and disappears into the dark above Iona Sound. It is late in the summer of 563. The last light left the western sky an hour ago. The house is a round house. It stands perhaps 8 meters across at its widest point. The walls are dry stone, built without mortar, the gaps packed with turf and moss cut from the boggy ground to the east of the settlement. The stones are the same grey-green color as the hillside they came from. From a distance, in poor light, the house is almost invisible against the land. The roof is the most important part of the structure. It sits on a ring of wooden posts driven into the earth floor inside the wall line. The posts are not oak. There is almost no native woodland on Iona by this period. The timber has come by boat, almost certainly from the coast of Argyll, perhaps from around Loch Melfort or the forested shores near present-day Kilmartin. The posts are rough cut, still showing the marks of an adze along their length. They lean slightly inward and support the main roof beams, which in turn carry a dense thatch of heather and reed. The heather has been laid in overlapping rows, thick enough to turn a heavy Atlantic rain. Inside, the floor is beaten earth. It is not flat. Years of feet have worn paths between the central hearth and the doorway, and between the hearth and the sleeping areas along the inner wall. The hearth itself sits roughly at the center of the house, slightly offset toward one side. It is a simple arrangement of flat stones set flush with the floor, forming a roughly rectangular platform about 1.5 meters long. The fire on it burns peat. The peat has been cut from the low boggy ground inland from the western shore and stacked to dry through the early summer. By this time of year, late summer, the dried peat burns slowly and with a dense, sweet-smelling smoke. There is no chimney. The smoke finds its own way upward through the interior air and out through the roof opening, but not before it has moved through the whole space of the house first. Every surface inside is coated with a thin film of soot. The thatch above holds years of it, blackened and dense. This is not entirely a problem. The smoke keeps insects out of the thatch and slows the rot of the roof timbers. The people who live here do not think of the smoke as a nuisance. It is simply part of the air inside. The doorway faces roughly east, away from the prevailing wind off the Atlantic. It is low, perhaps 1.5 meters high. A person of average height must duck to enter. The door itself is a wooden frame covered with stretched hide, hung on a wooden peg and pulled shut with a leather loop. In wet weather, a second piece of hide is hung outside the first. The gap at the base lets in a steady draft along the floor, and the family knows this. Children sit or sleep away from that draft, closer to the warmth of the hearth. The interior is divided, though not by walls. The division is understood through use. On one side of the hearth, toward the rear of the house, the family sleeps. The bedding is heather. Fresh heather cut from the hillside is the most common sleeping material on Iona at this period. It has been spread on the ground in a thick layer and covered with a rough woolen blanket or a piece of treated hide. The heather beneath the blanket compresses quickly but holds a little warmth and keeps the sleeper off the bare earths. Some households have raised sleeping platforms of split timber set about 30 centimeters above the floor on short posts. Not every house has these. The simplest households sleep directly on the heather layer. A family in this period and in this place means a broad grouping. It is not simply a mother and father and their own children. A household might contain a grandmother or grandfather, a brother-in-law, a foster child from another family. Fostering is common in early Irish and Scottish society at this period. Children are sent to live with related families or with families of slightly higher status, and this is a mark of connection between the households involved, not a sign of hardship. The foster child eats the same food as the other children. They sleep in the same part of the house. The children themselves are small by modern standards because their diet is limited in winter. In late summer, which is where we are now, they are doing better. There are fish to be had from the Sound. The sea around Iona in 563 is rich with saithe and pollock, with mackerel running close to shore in the warmer months, with limpets and whelks on every rock shelf at low tide. Children are sent to gather shellfish from the foreshore, and they do this at low water, filling small hide bags or folded strips of bark with limpets pried from the rock with a flat stone or a wooden wedge. The limpets are eaten boiled in a clay pot over the fire. They are also eaten raw at the shore, simply pulled from the shell with a finger. This is ordinary food. It is not a delicacy. The main crops grown on Iona in this period are barley and oats. The fields are small and irregular, following the pockets of usable soil on the island. The soil on Iona is thin in most places, sitting over the ancient Lewisian gneiss bedrock. But there are strips of better ground, particularly around the area to the north and east of the later medieval abbey site, where a combination of shell sand blown inland from the western beaches and accumulated organic material from centuries of habitation has built up a soil worth working. The barley is harvested with a small iron or bronze sickle. The grain is dried, then ground on a saddle quern, a flat lower stone and a rounded upper stone, worked by hand in a slow rocking motion. This is daily work for the women of the household. The flour it produces is coarse and grey. It is mixed with water and cooked as a flatbread on a flat stone set beside the fire, or made into a thin porridge in a clay pot. Both the bread and the porridge taste of smoke. Everything in this house tastes faintly of smoke. Cattle are kept. A household of any standing has at least 2 or 3 cattle. On Iona, the cattle are small, short-legged animals, closer in build to a modern Highland cow than to any improved breed. They are kept partly for milk and partly for their hides and draft capacity. They are not slaughtered freely. Killing a cow is a significant event, and the meat is shared. The milk is more valuable than the meat on an ordinary day. Milk is drunk fresh in summer and turned into a simple soft cheese by warming and straining it through cloth. It is also allowed to sour naturally and eaten in that form. There is no word in the daily vocabulary of this household that corresponds to the modern idea of a food allergy or a dietary preference. People eat what is available. There are also sheep on the island. Their wool is cut in late spring. The wool is processed by the women and older girls of the household. It is washed in fresh water, combed into rough alignment with the fingers or with a comb of bone or antler, and then spun on a drop spindle, a simple weighted stick that hangs and twists as the spinner drafts the fibers out by hand. The thread produced is uneven but strong. It is woven on an upright loom, a simple frame of timber posts with the warp threads held taut by loom weights of fired clay. Several of these small clay weights are typically found near the wall of the house, hanging from the warp ends. The cloth produced is plain woven and off-white or pale brown. It is not fine cloth. It is warm cloth. The clothing worn by ordinary people in Iona in 563 is simple. A man wears a long woolen tunic reaching to mid-thigh or knee, belted at the waist with a leather strap. Below this, he may wear woolen leg wrappings tied with leather thongs, or he may go bare-legged in summer. Footwear is a simple leather shoe, a single piece of hide gathered and stitched around the foot. Women wear a longer tunic, also of wool, with a separate piece of cloth wrapped or pinned at the shoulder. The pins used for this purpose are often of bronze, a simple ring-headed form. The clothing is not decorated at the level of an ordinary farming household. It is colored only by the natural tones of the undyed wool. Brown, gray, and off-white are the colors of daily life here. The pot on the fire is clay. Pottery on Iona in this period is handmade. It is not wheel-thrown. The clay is built up by hand in coiled rings, smoothed on the outside, and fired in an open bonfire rather than in a kiln. The result is a vessel that is functional but fragile. A cooking pot has a round base and slightly flared sides. It sits in the hearth embers rather than on them. Its surface is rough and often shows the marks of the grass or reed that the potter pressed against the clay during forming. Inside, after months of use over a peat fire, the pot is dark and heavily carbonized. Residues of boiled grain and boiled shellfish are built up in its base. When the pot breaks, which it does eventually, the fragments are not discarded far. They end up in the midden heap just outside the door to the east, mixed with ash, bone, shell, and the general refuse of a family's daily life. Water is carried to the house from a freshwater source, most likely one of the small burns or spring-fed pools that drain the interior of the island. The container used to carry water is either a clay vessel or, more practically for carrying, a wooden bucket with a hide or wooden lid. There is no elaborate system of water management. The woman of the household or an older child makes the trip to the water source each morning. In winter and wet weather, this trip happens in the dark, before the fire is rebuilt from its overnight embers. The light inside the house, when it is not natural daylight coming through the open door, is provided by the fire and by simple lamps. The lamps are small hollows of stone, sometimes shaped, sometimes simply a natural depression in a flat piece of gneiss, filled with rendered animal fat and fitted with a wick of twisted plant fiber, most likely rushes twisted and dried. The flame is small and yellow and throws a moving shadow across the inner wall. By modern measurement, the interior of this house at night, with the fire low and one lamp burning, has perhaps the same light level as a very dim corridor. People in this period see better in low light than modern eyes do, because they have no other kind of light to adapt to. But even so, detailed fine work is done during daylight hours when possible. The house smells of peat smoke, of damp wool, of the cattle who are sometimes brought inside in very cold weather, and pennied in a section of the roundhouse separated from the living area by a low stone partition. It smells of the sour milk in the clay bowl near the wall, and of the dried fish hanging from one of the roof timbers above the fire. The fish are saith, caught in the sound, split and dried in the wind off the Atlantic over the course of a week in late summer. They have shrunk and stiffened to hard, pale planks. They will keep through winter. They will be soaked in water before cooking, then boiled in the pot with water and sometimes a little of the dried grain. This is a winter meal. Right now, at the end of a summer evening, the family has eaten better than that. The children are asleep already, the youngest ones tucked close to the adult bodies for warmth, even in summer, because the stone walls hold the cold of the sea and the nights drop sharply once the brief northern twilight has gone. The older children are further along the sleeping area, their breathing steady and slow. Outside, the sound is dark. A small wind is moving off the water. The cattle have settled in the enclosure behind the house. The whole island is quiet except for the sea on the western shore, which is never entirely. The last light of an early summer evening settles over the western shore of Iona. The water between the island and the Ross of Mull lies flat and pale. A cormorant sits on a rock near the tide line, drying its wings in the still air. In 563 AD, Iona is a small island. It measures roughly 3 miles from north to south and 1.5 miles at its widest. The ground rises gently toward the hill the later Gaelic tradition will call Dunai, the highest point on the island at around 100 meters. To the west, a wide beach of white sand faces the open Atlantic. To the east, a narrow sound separates the island from the larger landmass of Mull. Columba has arrived this year. He comes from Ireland, from the kingdom of Dal Riata, which straddles both the north of Ireland and the western coastline of what is now Argyll. He brings 12 companions with him. The number is deliberate. It mirrors the apostles. The group lands on the southern tip of the island, at a bay that faces back toward Ireland. The island is not empty when they arrive. It has a small resident population. These are farming people, Gaelic-speaking, part of the same Dal Riotan culture that stretches across the water. They keep cattle. They grow grain on the small patches of workable ground near the southern and eastern shores. They fish. Their lives are tied to the sea and to the rhythm of seasons that in this latitude move between long summer days and very short winter ones. There is no town here. There is no market in any formal sense. Exchange on Iona in this period works through older patterns. Surplus grain, dried fish, wool from the small native sheep, hides from cattle slaughtered in late autumn. These things move between households and between the island and the mainland by boat. The sound crossing to Mull takes less than half an hour in calm water. Larger journeys go south to the Kintyre Peninsula or north toward Ardnamurchan. The boat most commonly used for these crossings is the curragh. It is a frame of wood or wickerwork covered with animal hide, sealed with grease or tallow. These vessels are light enough to be carried by two men. They are suited to beaches without harbours. A curragh can be pulled above the tide line at the end of a crossing and turned upside down to shelter the crew if the weather turns before a return journey. Columba himself makes many sea journeys in such a vessel. His later biographer, the Abbot Adomnan, writing about a century after Columba's death, records numerous crossings. The wind and the state of the tide matter enormously. On Iona, as on every island community in this period, the weather is read carefully and constantly. An unexpected westerly squall can make the sound impassable for hours. Everyone on the island understands this. The monastic community Columba establishes does not exist separately from the lay population. It sits alongside it. The monastery in 563 is not a stone building. It is a collection of simple timber and wattle structures built on slightly rising ground near the eastern shore. There is a church of this same construction. There is a guest house. There are small individual cells where the monks sleep. There is a kitchen, a refectory where the community eats together, a barn for storing grain. The church is the central gathering place. It is not large. In this period, early Irish monastic churches are typically small rectangular structures. They hold the community for the daily cycle of prayer. The monks gather there 7 times in each day and night, following the rule of prayer that comes from the Egyptian desert tradition, transmitted through Gaul and Ireland. The times are called the canonical hours. They begin before dawn with the night office, called vigils or nocturnes. The lay people of the island come to this church too, though not for every office. Sunday is the primary gathering day. The pattern of Sunday on Iona in 563 draws from both the older agricultural rhythms and the Christian framework Columba brings. Work is set aside. The community, monks and laypeople together, gathers for the liturgy. Mass is celebrated. There is communal prayer. There is the reading aloud of Scripture and, in all likelihood, of the lives of earlier saints or holy men from the Irish and Gaulish traditions. The readings matter practically. Literacy is rare among the lay population. The Scripture comes to most people through the spoken word. Columba himself is described by Adomnan as a man of striking presence and voice. He reads aloud to the community. The voice carries meaning that the written page cannot reach for most people on the island. After the Sunday liturgy, the rest of the day is lighter in its obligations. The fields are not tended, heavy physical labor is not performed, but life continues in quieter ways. Animals still need water and checking. Boats are inspected and repaired if needed, though the repair of a boat might be considered preparation for work rather than work itself, and different communities drew this line differently. Meals are shared. The monastic community eats together in the refectory. The lay households eat within their own buildings. The monastic diet in this period is spare. Bread made from barley or oats is the staple. Milk and dairy products are significant sources of sustenance. Fish is eaten regularly, given the island's position. Columba's community keeps to a practice of not eating meat on certain days. Adomnan's later account mentions fish, bread, and water as typical fare during periods of fasting or penance. Vegetables grown in the monastery's small garden plot contribute to the diet, including leeks and other hardy plants suitable for the Atlantic climate. The lay population eats in a way shaped more by availability than by religious rule. Oatmeal porridge, boiled in a pot over a central hearth, is a daily reality. Salt beef or salt pork, prepared in autumn from cattle and pigs slaughtered before the winter, carries the household through the coldest months. Dried or salted fish supplements this. Wild plants, seaweed among them, are gathered and eaten. Shellfish are collected from the rocks and tidal pools along the shore. The year moves through a set of fixed points. Some of these are Christian, some are older and have been absorbed into the Christian calendar rather than replaced by it. The Feast of Samhain, falling at the end of October, marks the point at which the darker half of the year begins. Cattle not kept through winter are killed at this time. Beltane, in early May, marks the return of warmth. Cattle are moved to summer pasture on this day, and fire plays a ritual role in the transition. Columba and his monks observe the major Christian feasts. Christmas, though in this period it has not yet taken on the elaboration it will later acquire, marks the Nativity. Easter is the most important feast in the Christian year. The dating of Easter is, in 563, a matter of serious theological controversy. The Irish Church, including Columba's community, follows a different calculation from the Roman practice. This difference will not be resolved, at least in Northumbria, until the Synod of Whitby in 664. On Iona, in Columba's time, Easter falls on a date determined by the Irish method. The approach to Easter involves a period of fasting and preparation. In the weeks before the feast, the diet of the monastic community becomes more restricted. Prayer intensifies. The nights before major feasts are marked by extended vigils, the community remaining in the church through hours that would ordinarily be given to sleep. On the feast day itself, the mood shifts. The fast is broken. The liturgy is celebratory rather than penitential. The Feast of Pentecost, 50 days after Easter, is another significant gathering point. The feasts of individual saints matter too. In the Irish tradition of this period, each monastic community has its own patron, and the feast of the founder or patron brings the wider community together in a particular way. On Iona, over time, the Feast of Columba himself will become such a day, though in 563 he is of course still living. The physical layout of the monastic enclosure provides the framework for community life. A circular or oval boundary ditch and bank, called the Vallum Monasteri in Latin sources, marks the edge of the sacred space. Adomnan describes this boundary on Iona. Within it, the church and the main monastic buildings sit. Beyond it, the farm buildings, the working land, the small round houses of the lay community. The boundary is not a wall in the later medieval sense. It is a marked threshold, understood by everyone who lives near it. Pilgrims begin arriving on Iona very early in Columba's time there. Adomnan's account suggests that visitors came to seek healing, counsel, or spiritual guidance from Columba directly. These visitors cross from Mull or come by boat from further along the Argyll coast or from Ireland. The guest house within the monastic enclosure is intended for them. Hospitality is a central obligation in both the Gaelic cultural tradition and the Christian monastic one. A visitor is received, fed, given a place to rest. The arrival of a boat is a notable event on a small island. Everyone is aware of it. The community near the shore sees it first. Word moves quickly across a space this compact. If a visitor of significance arrives, Columba is told. Adomnan records several such arrivals in detail, including visits from kings and from ecclesiastical figures travelling between Ireland and the Scottish mainland. These visits bring news. They bring news of events in Ireland, of political changes in Dal Riata, of conditions further afield. The monks themselves travel. This is a fundamental part of the monastic culture Columba represents. The Irish term for it is peregrinatio, a voluntary exile from home undertaken as a spiritual discipline. The monk leaves familiar ground and gives himself to travel and to the unknown as an act of trust. Columba's own arrival on Iona is, in one understanding, exactly this kind of departure. He leaves Ireland and settles where he can no longer see it from the shore. The monks who travel out from Iona carry the community's practices with them. They establish daughter houses, or they travel as missionaries to peoples who have not encountered Christianity in its Irish form. Columba himself travels to the Pictish kingdom to the north and east. He visits Brideye, the Pictish king, at his fortress near what is now Inverness, most likely in the later 560s. These journeys are overland as well as by sea, crossing mountain passes and river crossings that in this period have no bridges. On the days when Columba is present on the island, his day follows a strict structure: prayer at the canonical hours, manual labor, likely including work in the fields or the scriptorium, reading and copying of manuscripts, receiving visitors, meeting with the lay community around him. Adomnan describes him writing in his cell on the day of his death in 597. The cell is small, a place for one person to sleep and pray and work. The scriptorium is where manuscripts are copied. In 563, this is among the most significant activities taking place on the island. Columba is described by later tradition as a man who loved books and the act of copying. The manuscripts produced on Iona in this period are written on vellum, prepared from the skins of calves. The ink is made from oak gall. The quills come from birds, geese most likely, or swans. The process of preparing a single manuscript requires many skins and many hours of careful work. The books copied on Iona in this period are primarily liturgical. The Psalms are central, the Gospels, the rules of prayer that govern the canonical hours. Other texts from the Irish monastic tradition, including penitential handbooks that set out the precise spiritual consequences of specific sins and the corresponding acts of penance required. These books are practical objects used in the daily life of prayer. They are also precious. They are kept carefully. A book carried on a journey is wrapped in a protective leather satchel. The light on Iona in summer lasts very late. In June, the sky does not fully darken until well after 10 in the evening. This matters for the work of writing. The monks use this light. The hours between the afternoon office and the evening office are long in midsummer and can be given to reading or copying without the need for candles. In winter, the reverse is true. The days shorten dramatically. Candles of tallow or rush lights become necessary for any indoor work after mid-afternoon. The wind is almost always present. The island sits fully exposed to the Atlantic on its western side. Even on calm days, a breeze moves across the Machia, the low grassland behind the western beach. The Machia on Iona is used for grazing. Its thin sandy soil, enriched by shell fragments, is not well suited to arable cultivation, but supports grass well enough for cattle and sheep to graze through the warmer months. In spring, before the livestock are moved back onto it, it briefly holds wildflowers in large numbers, yellow and white, and pale purple against the green. The smell of the island changes through the year. In summer, cut hay and dried seaweed and the smoke of peat fires. In autumn, the sharper smell of butchered animals and the salt of curing meat. In winter, the heavy damp of wet wool and wet thatch. The monks and the lay community share this island air. They share the sound of the sea, always present, sometimes distant, sometimes very close. The tides move in and out twice each day. The rhythm is older than anyone on the island, older than the monastery, older than the name by which anyone yet calls this place. The monks pray it there. The boat came in from the east, across the Sound of Iona, in the long light of a June evening. The water in the Sound was shallow and cold. It ran over pale sand and grey rock, no more than a mile wide at its narrowest point. On the far shore, the Ross of Mull rose in dark ridges of Lewisian gneiss, the oldest surface rock in Britain, laid down more than 2,000 million years before. Iona itself was small. It measured roughly 3 miles from north to south and no more than 1.5 miles across at its widest. The island sat low in the water. Most of it was below 100 feet in elevation. Only the hill at the southern end, the one later called Dun Eye, rose above that modest line, reaching perhaps 330 feet at its summit. From the top on a clear morning, a man could see the paps of Jura to the south and the long ridge of Mull filling the eastern horizon. The shoreline in 563 was not a single thing. On the western side, the Atlantic came in hard. Long white beaches ran between headlands of pink and grey granite. The sand there was extraordinarily fine and pale, almost white, ground from shell and quartz over thousands of years. Behind the beaches, the matcha began. This was a low, flat strip of lime-rich grassland built up from wind-blown shell sand. In June, it was covered in flowers. Yellow trefoil, white clover, red clover, purple orchids, and yellow rattle grew so thickly that the ground had colour in every direction. Rabbits had not yet reached Scotland. The matcha was grazed by cattle and by sheep, and the turf was kept short by their mouths. The eastern side of the island was different. There the shore was rockier and more sheltered. The sound broke the wind. Seaweed grew thickly along the tidal margins. Bladder wrack and kelp draped the lower rocks. Above the tide line, the ground was damper and the grass coarser. This was where the island's small harbour lay, such as it was. There was no constructed quay in 563. Boats were drawn up on a natural beach of grey sand and small stones, sheltered by a low headland to the north. The beach faced east and slightly north, giving it some protection from the southwesterly winds that came off the Atlantic. The island had no rivers in the way that the mainland had rivers. It was too small and too flat for that. What it had were shallow streams running from the boggy ground in the interior toward the sea. The longest of these was perhaps half a mile in length. They ran quickly after rain and slowed to a trickle in dry weather. In June, they were still carrying the last of the spring water. They ran over peat and then over sand, and where they reached the beach, they spread out and disappeared into the shingle. There were several small locks on the island. The largest sat in the northern part, a shallow body of fresh water no more than a few acres in extent. Moorhens and ducks used it. The water was dark with peat. Around its edges, rushes and sedges grew in thick clumps. A second, smaller pool lay further south, fed by seepage from the surrounding bog. These locks did not drain directly to the sea. Their water moved slowly outward through the peat and the sand, finding the shore gradually rather than all at once. The interior of the island was mostly moorland. Heather covered the higher ground, though the ridges were low. Bell heather and cross-leaved heath grew together in patches. Between the heather, bog cotton stood in white tufts that moved in the lightest wind. The ground was wet underfoot for most of the year. Sphagnum moss filled the hollows and built up slowly over centuries into deep peat banks. A man walking across the interior in the early morning would feel the ground give slightly with each step. The peat held water like a sponge and released it slowly through the summer. The cattle on the island in 563 were small by later standards. They were the native cattle of Atlantic Britain, short-legged and hardy, with wide horns. Their coats were dark, mostly black or dark brown. They were kept primarily for milk rather than meat. A small herd could have been maintained on the matcha grassland through the summer months. In winter, the grazing became thin. Cattle in Atlantic Scotland in the 6th century were often brought inside during the worst weather, or at least moved to lower, more sheltered ground. Sheep were present too. The sheep of that period were closer to the Soay breed, small and fine-boned, with brownish fleeces that they shed naturally in summer without shearing. They could survive on rough grazing that would not support cattle. They moved across the Machea and onto the lower heather ground without difficulty. Their milk was taken as well as their wool. The wool was pulled rather than cut, gathered in summer when the fleece had already begun to loosen at the edges. A generation before 563, the island had seen no permanent Christian settlement. It is likely it had seen little permanent settlement of any kind. The Dal Rioter were establishing themselves along the western coast of what is now Argyll in the early and middle 6th century, crossing and recrossing from what is now County Antrim in the north of Ireland. The sea between those shores was a thoroughfare, not a barrier. The sound of Iona would have been known to fishermen and to occasional travellers, but the island itself held no particular significance in those years. A generation before Columba, the island would have looked much the same in its physical features. The Machea would have been there. The shallow streams would have been there. The eastern beach would have been the same grey strand, but the land would have been uncleared. There would have been scrubby woodland in the more sheltered hollows, hazel and willow, and perhaps a little birch growing low and wind-bent on the leeward side of ridges. The island receives around 50 inches of rain each year, and the wind is near constant from the southwest. Trees do not stand tall in that exposure. They grow sideways, if they grow at all. By 563, some of that scrubby cover would have been cleared, probably by the small farming communities that used the island intermittently before Columba arrived. There is evidence from similar Atlantic sites that small groups kept cattle on these islands seasonally, moving between the islands and the mainland with the seasons. The Machea of Iona was rich ground by the standards of the region. Shell sand lifted the pH of the soil and made it more fertile than the acid peat of the interior. Grain could be grown on the Machea in good years. Barley was the principal crop of Atlantic Scotland in the 6th century. The wind shaped everything on the island. It came most persistently from the southwest. It drove salt spray inland across the western beaches and suppressed the growth of anything taller than the heather. On the eastern side, sheltered by the island's own low mass, the air was slightly calmer. The soil on the eastern side was darker and deeper in places. This is where cultivation was most practical. Small plots could be worked with a simple wooden plough or with spades and mattocks, turning the dark earth over in spring before the barley was sown. The sea itself was a constant presence in a way that is difficult to overstate. Iona had no land connection to anywhere. Every object on the island that was not made from local stone or local timber had come across water. Every person on the island had come across water. The sound between Iona and Mull was the main approach. The crossing was short, barely more than a mile, but in poor weather it became difficult. The tides ran through the sound with some force. A coracle or a small curragh could be swamped if the wind was against the tide. The curragh was the vessel of the period. It was built from a framework of flexible wood, ash or willow, bent and lashed together, then covered with hides cured and stitched. A large curragh could carry 12 men and substantial cargo. A small one could be managed by 2. They were light enough to be carried across a beach on a man's back. They sat high in the water and rode waves rather than pushing through them. In the hands of experienced crews, they were capable of long open water passages. Columba and his 12 companions had crossed from Ireland in curraghs, though the precise route across the North Channel is not recorded. The fish in the Sound of Iona in June would have been abundant. Herring moved through the Hebridean waters in summer. Cod and saithe were caught close to the rocks. Smaller species, pollock and wrasse, lived among the kelp beds on the eastern shore. The islanders of the period, wherever they were settled along this coast, ate fish regularly. They gathered shellfish from the rocks. Mussels, limpets, and periwinkles were scraped from the stone at low tide. Limpets in particular were a staple of coastal life in Atlantic Scotland through all of the early medieval period. They required no vessel, no net, and no equipment beyond a flat stone or an iron blade. The seasons marked time clearly on the island. In January and February, the matcha was bare and brown. The cattle stood close together in the lee of whatever shelter they could find. The days were short, barely 7 hours of usable light. Rain came in long grey curtains from the west. The streams ran high and brown with peat water. The lochs were full to their edges. Snow was possible, but not common at sea level on Iona. The island sits at roughly 56 degrees north, but the Atlantic keeps the temperature moderate. Hard frost was infrequent. March and April brought the change. The grass began to grow again on the matcha. The first flowers appeared in the shell sand. Oyster catchers returned to the beaches and began to nest. Fulmars came back to the cliff ledges on the western shore. The days lengthened quickly at that latitude. By the end of April, there were 15 hours between sunrise and sunset. The cattle were leaner after the winter, but the milk came back with the new grass. This was the critical time for the people of the island. It was the point at which the winter stores had been exhausted and the new growth had not yet fully come. June was the most generous month. The matcha was at its height. The cattle were giving good milk. The barley sown in April was growing steadily in the cultivation strips near the eastern shore. The days were very long. At midsummer, true darkness barely fell on Iona. The sky went grey and dim for a few hours around midnight, then lightened again. For people accustomed to the darkness and cold of winter, these long June evenings must have been a different kind of time entirely. But there is no record of what they felt, only of what was there. The sound between Iona and Mull was visible from almost anywhere on the island. On summer evenings, it reflected the long light in the west. The surface broke into small ripples wherever a current ran against the wind. Seals hauled out on the rocks at the southern tip of the island. the flat grey rocks that were exposed at low tide. Grey seals were common in the Hebrides. They were present in numbers that later centuries would reduce considerably. In 563, they were an unremarkable part of the landscape, lying in groups on the tide-washed rocks, indifferent to the cormorants drying their wings on the boulders beside them. The gneiss rock of the island itself was ancient beyond any frame of reference available to the people who walked across it. It had been on the surface of the earth since, before most of what is now Scotland existed at all. It was pink and grey and dark, streaked with veins of quartz and feldspar. It broke into rounded shapes rather than sharp ones, worn by ice and by water over an enormous span of time. The soil that had formed over it was thin in most places. Dig down a foot in the moorland, and the rock was there beneath the peat. On the match here, the shell sand lay on the gneiss directly. The island had little depth to it in any direction. It was a thin place in that literal, physical sense. Rock and sea and sky, and not much in between. The summer of 563 was the first summer of the monastery. The community that arrived with Columba in that season was small. They had come to a real place, a working Atlantic island with its cold water and its wind and its pale beaches and its. The sun drops behind the ridge of Dun Eye just after the 9th hour. The light goes slowly here, pulling back across the water in long, flat sheets. The sound of Iona turns from grey-green to a deep, still pewter. The far hills of Mull catch the last of it, holding a line of amber for a few minutes before that too fades. The monks are finishing their evening work. Some have been cutting peat since the early afternoon. Their tools are simple iron spades with wooden handles, worn smooth at the grip. The peat here is cut in long rectangular blocks from the low ground east of the settlement. Each block is roughly the size of a man's forearm. They are stacked in small rows to dry, though the drying will not be finished tonight. The settlement itself is not stone, not yet. The buildings are timber-framed, with walls of wattle packed with daub. The roofs are thatched with reed and bracken. There are perhaps a dozen structures in total, arranged without formal plan on the western slope of the island, sheltered slightly from the Atlantic wind. The ground around them is soft, dark earth, cut with narrow paths worn by daily passage. Columba himself has been writing. He works on vellum, prepared from the skins of young cattle. The vellum is scraped thin with a curved iron blade called a lunellum. The ink is made from oak galls mixed with iron salts and a little gum. It dries dark on the page. He writes in the Irish hand, small and careful, the letters formed without flourish. The light through the small opening in his cell wall has been fading since the 6th hour, and now it is nearly gone. A fire is lit in the main building, which serves as the communal hall and refectory. It burns at the center of the floor. The smoke rises through a hole cut in the thatch. There is no chimney. The air inside holds a permanent layer of smoke above head height. The monks do not notice it after the first weeks. It becomes part of the place, like the smell of the sea. The meal tonight is simple. It is almost always simple. There is a grain porridge made from barley, cooked in a clay pot suspended over the fire on an iron chain. The barley was grown in the small fields to the south of the settlement, strip-farmed by hand with wooden ards tipped with iron. It was harvested in August using short iron sickles. The grain was dried, then ground on a rotary quern, two flat circular stones, one turned by hand above the other. There is also dried fish. The monks catch fish from the surrounding waters in small hide-covered boats called curras. These are frame vessels of hazel or ash, covered with stitched oxhide treated with animal fat to seal it against the water. They sit low in the sea. They are light enough for two men to carry. Tonight the fish are pollock, caught 2 days ago and dried in the wind on wooden frames above the shore. There may be some milk. The community keeps a small number of cattle. The cows are small, dark-coated animals, closer in build to aurochs than to any modern breed. They have been milked in the late afternoon, the work done by one of the junior monks. The milk is kept in a wooden vessel bound with strips of hide. Some of it will sour before morning. The monks eat in near silence. The rule observed here, drawn from the practices of the Irish Church and from the Desert Fathers before that, requires that meals be taken quietly, with attention. One monk reads aloud from a manuscript while the others eat. Tonight the reading is from the Psalms. The words are in Latin. Most of the monks understand them. A few of the younger men, newly arrived from Ireland, are still learning. Outside the hall, the evening sounds are settling into their pattern. The wind comes in from the west, as it almost always does. It runs through the coarse grass along the shoreline with a dry, papery sound. The sea on the western beach is low tonight. There is a slow, regular rhythm to the waves, each one separating cleanly from the last. Farther out, past the small islet of Soa, the water is entirely dark. There are seabirds still calling. Oyster catchers move along the tide line, probing the wet sand with their long orange bills. Their call is sharp and piping, carrying easily in the still air. A few razorbills are settling on the low rocks to the south. Gannets have been visible all day offshore, white shapes dropping vertically into the water from a great height. By now, most of them have returned to their roost. A monk is repairing a curragh on the shore. He works by the last of the light, stitching a split in the hide with a bone needle and waxed thread. The split opened during the afternoon crossing from Mull. The hide is stiff and resistant, and the work takes both hands. He braces the boat against his knee to hold the seam taut. The repair will need to be greased again before morning. The younger monks carry out their assigned tasks in the hour before the night office. One carries water from a spring to the north of the settlement in a wooden bucket suspended on a shoulder yoke. The spring runs all year. The water is cold even in summer. It is used for cooking, for washing, and for the preparation of ink. 2 others are gathering bracken for fresh bedding. The sleeping cells have beds of heather and bracken laid on the earth floor. The bracken compresses quickly and must be freshened every few days. The clothing the monks wear is plain. They have rough woolen tunics, undyed or a natural off-white color falling to the knee. Over this they wear a longer outer garment, a cowl or hooded cloak, also woolen. Their feet are bare or shod in simple leather shoes, cut from a single piece of hide and tied across the ankle. The shoes are not waterproof. They do not last long in the wet ground of Iona. Making new ones is a regular task. Columba finishes his writing and sets the manuscript aside. He presses a small piece of wax over the ink pot to keep it from drying. He closes the wooden board covers of the book he has been working in. The boards are tied shut with a leather strap. He does not leave the manuscript on the floor. It is placed on a narrow wooden shelf fixed to the wall of his cell. Books here are objects of considerable labor and considerable value. The bell is rung for vespers. It is a small iron handbell cast in a simple mold, undecorated. The sound it makes is not large. It carries perhaps 100 yards in still air. But the settlement is small and every monk is within earshot. They leave their tasks and move toward the oratory, the small chapel that stands at the center of the community. The chapel is also timber-framed, a little larger than the sleeping cells, with a single door facing east. The oratory floor is bare earth. There are no seats. The monks stand during the office or in some cases kneel. The prayers at Vespers follow a fixed order established in the Irish monastic tradition. Psalms, a short reading, responses, a closing prayer. The whole office takes perhaps 20 minutes. The voices of perhaps 18 or 20 men rise and fall together in the dark interior. There is a single oil lamp burning near the altar. The altar itself is a plain stone slab resting on two smaller stones. After Vespers, there is a brief period before Compline, the final office of the day. The monks return to the hall. Some talk quietly. The conversations are practical. There is discussion about the state of the peat stack, about whether it is dry enough to be moved inside before the next rain. There is mention of a boat that arrived from the Irish coast 2 days ago, carrying a young man who wants to join the community. He has been staying in a small outer cell, separate from the monks, for the required period of discernment. The wind has picked up slightly. The thatch on the hall roof moves and settles with a low, shifting sound. A few sparks from the fire rise through the smoke hole and go dark almost immediately in the air above. The fire is banked for the night now, the larger pieces of peat laid close together to hold a slow burn until morning. A monk checks it before leaving. He adjusts one of the outer pieces with a stick. The island at night in 563 is almost entirely dark. There are no settlements other than this one. The farmland to the south holds no buildings of consequence. The shore to the north, beyond Duneye, is uninhabited. The light from the hall fire, escaping through the smoke hole and around the edges of the doorway, is the only warm light visible for miles. Anyone crossing the Sound of Iona in a boat tonight would see it clearly. The cattle have been moved into their enclosure for the night. It is a simple ring of wooden posts and hurdles. The animals stand quietly inside it. There is a low sound from them occasionally, a soft exhalation, the shift of weight from one leg to another. One of the monks passes the enclosure on his way back to his cell. He does not stop. The cattle are not his concern tonight. The stone beach on the eastern side of the island makes a particular sound in the dark. The waves here do not break, but rather push the stones forward and draw them back. The sound is a long, grinding rattle, followed by a slower hiss as the water retreats. It continues all night without pause. The monks who sleep closest to the shore hear it in the background of every night. They have stopped registering it as sound. It is simply there, the way the cold is simply there. The curraghs have been pulled above the tide line for the night. They rest upside down on the shore, their dark hulls against the pale stone, 3 boats in total. They are turned so the hide surface is protected from frost. One of them, the one that was repaired this evening, is slightly apart from the others. It will be checked again in the morning before it is used. The moon tonight is past its 3rd quarter. It rises late to the east over the low ground of Mull. When it clears the horizon, it gives enough light to see the path between the main buildings. The path is white with crushed shell mixed into the earth over years of use. By moonlight it is a slightly paler line in the darkness, just visible enough. Compline is brief. It is the shortest office of the day. A single psalm, a prayer, a blessing. The monks disperse to their cells without conversation. Each cell is a small separate structure, barely large enough to lie down in. There is no heating. The bracken bedding holds some warmth. The monks sleep in their outer cloaks, pulled close. The night temperature on Iona in late summer drops to perhaps 10 degrees. In winter it drops further. The cold is not unusual. It is expected. Columba's cell is slightly larger than the others. This is not luxury. It reflects the need for space to write, to receive visitors, to keep manuscripts. There is a stone used as a pillow. This is not unusual in the Irish monastic tradition of the period. Stone pillows are recorded in several accounts of the early monasteries. It is a practice of deliberate austerity, a small, chosen discomfort at the end of the working day. The fire in the hall burns lower. The peat gives off a thin, sweet smoke, different from wood smoke, earthier, with a mineral undertone. It settles into the thatch and the walls and the clothing of the monks. It is the smell of the community as much as any other smell. Visitors arriving from elsewhere notice it first. The monks themselves carry it with them when they travel, on the fibers of their wool cloaks, in their hair. The water in the bay to the west is completely still now. The wind has dropped in the last hour. The surface reflects what little skylight remains, a faint diffuse brightness low in the west where the sun went down. The outline of Soa is a dark mass against that light. Farther out, beyond any visible shore, the Atlantic continues into. The tide comes in quietly on the western shore. The water moves against the pale sand in long, slow lines. There is no wind this evening. The sea lies almost flat between Iona and the dark shape of Mull to the east. The island is small. It measures roughly 3 miles from north to south and less than a mile and a half across at its widest point. The ground is low and open, mostly grass and rock, with shallow soil that sits over ancient pink granite. There are no trees to speak of. The light fades evenly here, without shadow, because there is nothing tall enough to cast one. Columba arrived on this island with 12 companions earlier this same year. They came from Ireland, crossing the narrow sea in a curragh. A curragh is a boat made from a wooden frame covered in hides, sealed with fat or pine resin. It sits low in the water. A crossing from the Irish coast to Iona in such a vessel takes the better part of a day in reasonable weather. They landed on the southern shore, near a small beach the later monks would call the bay at the back of the ocean. The community they are building is called a monastery, but in 563 the word carries a different weight than it will centuries later. There is no stone church yet. There are no arched windows, no bell tower, no flagged floor. What exists tonight is a collection of simple structures built from timber, wattle, and turf. Each monk sleeps in his own cell, a small hut barely large enough to lie down in. The walls are woven branches packed with earth and grass. The roof is thatch, cut from the reeds and heather that grow across the island. The enclosure itself is marked by a low earthen bank. It runs in a rough oval around the cluster of buildings. This boundary is called a vallum. It is not a defensive wall. It is a boundary, a line between the world of the monks and the world outside. The bank stands perhaps a meter high in places. Beyond it, the grazing land begins immediately. There are cattle on the island. Iona could support a small herd in this period, grazing on the Machia, which is the low, grassy plain that runs along the western side. Machia soil is rich in shell sand. It grows a fine, short grass, good for animals. By this hour, the cattle have moved away from the shore. They stand somewhere in the darkness to the north, still and quiet, occasionally shifting their weight. There are also pigs. The monks would have kept pigs, feeding them on scraps and whatever forage the land provided. Pigs do not settle as quietly as cattle. In the last hour before full dark, a pig somewhere near the kitchen building moves against the wall of its enclosure. The sound is brief and then stops. There is no artificial light visible anywhere outside the buildings. There are no gas lamps. There are no candles burning in windows. The windows of the huts, if they have openings at all, are covered with cloth or animal skin to keep out the cold. The only light that might be visible from outside would come from the small hearth inside the main communal building, where the monks gather to eat and to pray. That hearth burns peat. Iona has shallow peat deposits, and the monks would have cut it from the boggy ground in the interior of the island. Peat burns slowly. It gives off a low, steady heat and a particular smell, slightly sweet, slightly acrid. By this hour, the fire has been banked down. It is not put out entirely. Keeping embers alive through the night means less effort in the morning. A monk responsible for the fire will have covered it with a layer of ash and a block of unburnt peat before he left for his cell. The main building also holds the community's food stores. In 563, These would include dried fish, oats, and perhaps some barley. The monks ate simply and not very much. Their rule, based on the practices of Irish monastic communities, demanded regular fasting. On fast days they ate once, in the evening. On other days they might eat twice, at midday and again in the evening. The evening meal was modest: boiled grain, perhaps a piece of dried fish, water or thin milk from the cattle. The oats were grown in small plots on the island itself. The ground near the southern end of Iona, where the soil sits a little deeper, could be turned with a simple plough or a spade. The monks cultivated this land themselves. Physical labor was part of the daily rule. A monk might spend part of his morning in prayer, part copying manuscripts, and part digging or carrying or hauling. By the time darkness is fully down, the manuscript work has stopped. Writing requires light. The monks copied texts on vellum, which is prepared animal skin, using quills cut from feathers. The ink was made from oak gall, a compound produced by a wasp's eggs inside an oak tree, mixed with iron salts and gum arabic. This ink is dark and permanent, but it cannot be made or used in darkness. The scriptorium, such as it is in this early period, is empty and cold. The night here is not entirely silent. The sea makes a continuous sound, low and present on all sides. Iona is surrounded by water, and the sound of it changes with the tide. At high tide, as it is now, the water pushes against the rocks on the northern and eastern shores with a regular, hollow knock. At low tide, the sound recedes, and the exposed rock and sand take its place, silent and flat. There are birds. Iona sits on a route used by seabirds moving between feeding grounds. Gannets, shearwaters, and fulmars pass close to the island during the day. At night, the seabirds are quiet, resting on the water or on the lower rocks. But there are also land birds. Corncrakes were common in this period across the Scottish islands. The corncrake is a small, secretive bird that lives in long grass and hay meadows. Its call is a dry, repeating rasp, like a comb dragged across a wooden edge. It calls at night. It calls persistently. There would have been corncrakes calling in the rough grass beyond the vallum this evening. The sky above the island is entirely dark. There is no moon tonight, or the moon has not yet risen. The stars are visible in extraordinary numbers. In 563, there is no light pollution anywhere on the British Isles outside of a very few settlement fires. The sky above Iona on a clear night would have shown the full band of the Milky Way, sharp and white across the southern horizon. The monks knew the stars. Navigation, both at sea and in the calculation of the church calendar, depended on knowing the movements of specific stars and planets. Columba himself is not yet asleep. He is the abbot, the head of this community. His cell is slightly larger than the others, though not by much. It may contain a writing tablet, a few rolls of vellum, and a simple wooden cross on the wall. He sleeps on a stone pillow. This is not a metaphor or an exaggeration. Irish monastic tradition in this period treated bodily comfort as something to be reduced, not increased. A stone pillow was a deliberate choice. So was the cold. The island gets cold at night even in summer. The latitude of Iona is roughly 56 degrees north. The Gulf Stream moderates the temperature, keeping the winters milder than they might otherwise be, but the nights in late spring and early summer can still drop to near 5 degrees. The monks slept in their clothes. They wore a simple linen undergarment called a lane, and over it a woolen robe with a hood. The hood is important. It was worn up, pulled close around the face, in cold weather. The robe was undyed or lightly dyed in the natural colors of the wool, cream or gray or pale brown. Outside the vallum there is almost nothing. The island had a small existing population before the monks arrived. There may have been a handful of families farming the machia and fishing from the southern bay. By this period in the 6th century, the local people of the Inner Hebrides were a mixture of indigenous Pictish-speaking inhabitants and Gaelic-speaking settlers from Dal Rhiata, the kingdom that stretched across both northeastern Ireland and western Scotland. Columba himself was from a noble Irish family within Dal Rhiata. He spoke Old Irish, which was closely related to the Gaelic spoken on the Scottish side of the water. The nearest settlement of any size to Iona in this period was probably on Mull, across the Sound to the east. The Sound of Iona is about a mile wide at its narrowest point. On a clear night like this one, a fire on the Mull shore would have been visible from Iona, and vice versa. But there is no fire visible tonight on Mull. The people on that shore are also sleeping. The water between the two islands is not calm at all times. The Sound of Iona can run with strong tidal currents. At certain states of the tide, the water moves quickly and in conflicting directions, producing standing waves. Crossing in a small boat at the wrong moment requires care and experience. The monks who came and went between the island and the mainland knew the tides. They read the water the way a farmer reads the sky. The boats pulled up on the shore tonight are curraghs, the same type used for the crossing from Ireland. They have been dragged above the high tide line and turned upside down to keep the rain out of them. Their hulls face upward, dark shapes on the pale sand. The hides stretched over them are stiffening in the night cold. In the morning, before any crossing, a monk would check the seams and press any that seemed loose with a small amount of fat kept in a clay pot near the boats. There are no torches burning on the beach. There is no one on the beach. The beach is empty and the boats are still and the tide is near its highest point. The water comes up close to the lowest boat without quite reaching it. Then the tide begins, slowly and without announcement, to turn. Inside the enclosure, the last movement of the evening has been the completion of the Compline prayer. Compline is the final prayer of the monastic day. In the 6th century Irish tradition, this prayer was said communally. The monks gathered in the oratory, which was the small building set aside for prayer. They would have said it in Latin, though their Latin was learned, not native. The words came from the Psalms and from short scriptural passages memorized over years of repetition. After Compline, silence. The rule of the monastery required silence from the end of the evening prayer until after the first prayer of the following morning. That first prayer, called matins or nocturnes depending on the tradition, was said in the deep middle of the night, around 2 or 3 in the morning. Between Compline and matins, no one spoke. No one was supposed to move between the cells, except in necessary silence. The silence after Compline settles over the enclosure like the cold. It is not absence, it is a practiced, deliberate thing. The monks have made it, they have chosen it. It lies over the small buildings and the low earthen bank and the empty ground beyond, and it joins itself to the larger silence of the island, which has no town in it, no market, no. That's where we'll leave it for tonight. The story is finished, but the night isn't, so let this play on as long as it helps. If Tartan Lullaby has been good company, you're welcome to subscribe so the next story finds you. There's no rush. If you'd like to see the landscapes that go with these stories, the art prints are at Tartan Lullaby Art on Etsy, with mood boards and stills on Pinterest under the same name. The links are in the description below. Until next time, thank you for listening. Sleep well, all is well.